Welcome back to the last part of the show with me, Alexis Conran, here on Talk Radio, powered by The Times. Know your times. With me, my studio guest at the moment is Michael Pugh. He's the director and co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. It's a lobby group pushing for the adoption of universal basic income, which we've been describing. Their website launches tomorrow. Where can people find the website, Michael?
It's simply basicincomeconversation.org.
There we go. We've done that bit. We'll remind me to do it at the end.
We'll do a plug at the end.
But here's quite a few questions coming in for you. Questions which I'd planned to ask, but I'm going to let my listeners do that. So we have on YouTube, Kat says, how long would it take to introduce it?
Well, it would. First of all, we need to persuade the decision maker to do it,
Yes.
which is partly where the basic income conversation comes in.
Bearing in mind, we've seen universal credit take, 7 years and it's still not fully rolled out.
Yes. It would take, for example, there was a recent person running for president in the United States called Andrew Yang. He committed to introduce the basic income within a year. In some ways, it's a much simpler argument as, say, something like universal credit, which is, a whole range of different benefits being put together. This is a very simple idea, really, of just giving every single person the same amount of money. So it wouldn't be as complex as other systems to roll out.
Next one, Kevin on Twitter, and I think this is the question that quite a lot of people are skeptical about, is, has it worked anywhere else? Because it sort of sounds like a very attractive idea to some people, but then you start thinking, well, hang on a minute, it's not a new idea. It's quite an old concept. Well, how come no one's actually put it into practice?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's firstly important to tell your listeners that nowhere has tried a universal basic income in the way that we are talking about. So we do rely on the sort of the pilots and the experiments that have taken place around the world, which there are many. So in sort of Canada, the United States, Finland, the Netherlands, India, Kenya, and many more. And I was really lucky to be able to visit two of those places last summer, and which are two examples that are fresh in my mind. One of them is Canada, where they trialled it both in the 1970s and more recently in Ontario. It had a huge impact on health, for example. Mm-hmm. So actually A&E admissions went down by about 8% in the areas in which they had basic income, which is quite striking when you consider that impact on people's health.
Certainly the NHS could do with an 8% reduction.
When you speak to any sort of NHS professionals and say you can find an 8 to 9% reduction in your costs, they would bite your hand off for something like that. The other experiences, though, was the voices of people that I met who had experienced basic income, particularly in Ontario. They said that they had, some of them had started their own businesses. The local high street was thriving again. People were spending more time with their families, eating healthier food. And one of the interesting things that kept coming up was the phrase that I feel human again. And I was listening to your show earlier about the conversation of universal credit and this kind of lack of dignity that we have. When we provide people with security and trust people, it has a huge impact on a positive impact on our mental health. The other place that I visited, which is kind of midway through their pilot at the moment, is Stockton, California, which is giving about 125 people $500 a month as part of a trial. And the phrase that was used, that kept coming up when researchers were speaking to the participants, was, I can breathe. I can breathe again. And I think that's what that suggests, is that we are somehow strangling people in a way, and that basic income can breathe new life into our communities.
It's funny, you touched upon something earlier, which, again, it's one of those sort of conflicts that you spot over and over again because of the partisanship of politics now, where people are sort of either on one side or on the other. But it's funny, and looking at the Twitter feed, you can basically tell from the Twitter profiles of people where they stand politically. And the biggest pushback has been from quite right-wing accounts, Brexit-supporting accounts. And it's quite interesting that it's the same accounts that don't like any sort of idea of a nanny state. But it's the same accounts sort of getting themselves into awful mental contortions right now where they go, well, I don't want to give money to people who are just going to spend it on drink and drugs and, waste it. So on that side, they believe that the nanny state should tell you what you should spend your money on. But if it comes to UBI, like, oh, I don't like that. We don't want people making their own decisions. I really need to go and think in a quiet room before posting all this nonsense.
I agree. I think one of the values that cuts across the political divide when we talk about basic income is this idea of freedom. Actually, people don't like being told what they can and can't spend it on.
And you'd think that people against a nanny state who want all about free market and the people, we want less government, not more government, they'd love UBI. But no, someone's told them they need to hate it.
Well, there definitely is a conservative argument for basic income. Another one of the pilots was in Finland, which was actually a conservative government that introduced that pilot. There, again, they found similar results around mental health being improved, and they couldn't find any impact on work, which was one of the common fears that people have around it. So I think there's definitely, there's a frustration out there amongst the country about how we've ended up in this sort of left, right, good, bad kind of politics that's so divisive. And I think basic income is one of those ideas that can cut across that and move us forward, actually, into sort of ideas of the 21st century.
But it is important to say that there have been all these studies, and you've spoke very positively about all these studies. However, as a result of all these studies, no governments have chosen to put universal basic income into action. Why?
It's a good question. There's no hiding that we are talking about a really big change. And at key junctures over points in our history, governments have decided to follow a different path when it comes to our social security system. We are talking about a shift in the way we think socially and politically, and that requires a big shift in thinking. And I think up until this point, the basic income argument has often been made by pilots and academic papers, and we haven't really started to have that argument and conversation with the wider public. And that's why we set up this organisation, so that we can start to build the movement, start to base this
answering
argument.
The questions as well.
Yeah, and rather than sort of saying, no, this is the silver bullet and this is going to change everyone's life, start to have that dialogue with people so that we can take people with us.
Another question from Foxabillo, I don't know what the name is, on YouTube, says, and this is an interesting one, what's to stop prices going up to absorb the UBI? So you're potentially giving £5,200 per person in the UK. Businesses are going, well, hang on a minute, there's all that extra cash sloshing around in the economy. We're just going to put our prices up a little bit to get hold of that cash.
Yeah, it's a good question. People often ask it. I think there's two answers to it. Three. There's no evidence to suggest that would be inflationary. The reasons for that is that there are the usual pressures in our economy that keep inflation low, so competition for prices and things. And in an economy with basic income, that competition amongst businesses and landlords, etc., would be even greater. And we're also not printing any new money. This is the same money, just being shifted around the economy in a different way.
Good point. Last question here from Tristan on YouTube said, would it not be fairer? He's put that in quotes. I don't understand why. Fairer, okay. Would it not be fairer to offer certain help? Food, water, electric vouchers. Surely hard cash could be spent on harmful things.
Well, I think it goes back to that conversation around trusting people.
Nanny state.
Yeah. And I've been a community organiser for a number of years and worked with communities on the ground who are thinking about the challenges that they face. And very often it's not some sort of service that they need from the government. People just lack cash. And I think we should trust people to spend it as they wish. And I think when we have the conversation and we ask people, how would you spend it? So often it's positive reasons. And I think we should ask ourselves, if we think we're going to spend it in a positive way, why do we think other people are going to somehow waste this? I think that's something that we've taught ourselves, sadly, in our society, where we don't trust others.
So the website launches tomorrow, basicincomeconversation.org. What are the next steps? How do you start the process of rolling this out into public consciousness and getting people talking about it?
Yeah, well, firstly, it's really exciting because we're not starting from scratch. There's already a lot of energy behind the idea. There are a number of groups that have set up right across the country. You might have seen recently 3 local authorities, Liverpool, Sheffield, Hull, have all joined the call for expressing an interest in piloting it here in the UK. Scotland, the Scottish Government introduced a feasibility study to look into what pilots would look like. We are expecting that report to land in the summer, in which we are expecting it to recommend a pilot. So we are looking to build on some of that energy. We're asking people to join the conversation on the website tomorrow. What they'll receive from us is some training and support and toolkits about how to have this conversation at home. So whether it's around the dinner table with friends and family, whether it's down the pub or in the school playground, hosting your own event in the local community or attending one, whichever you feel comfortable with, we'll be able to support you with. And we'll be, over the course of the next year, hearing some of those stories, listening to them, and forming that into a narrative that we think can start to move the conversation along on a political sense, and kind of join it up with some of the existing research that is out there. We're going to have a research network that will be building the credibility of the argument, as well as working with our cross-party network of supporters in Parliament and local authorities around the country.
Do you have supporters in Parliament? I know the Green Party, it was in their manifesto, but have you got support in Parliament, cross-party support?
There is cross-party support for it. For example, in Hull, it was the Liberal Democrats that promoted the idea, and Ed Davey, who's running for leadership of the Lib Dems, has been a public supporter of it. Labour had it in their manifesto in the form of pilots, which had support from the likes of John McDonnell, but also Ed Miliband. We've got a summit of activists coming together on the next Saturday, where Olivia Blake, the newly elected MP for Sheffield, is joining us. And of course, as I mentioned just before, the Scottish Government, the SNP, have expressed interest in the idea. So there is a growing cross-party support for the idea, and we hope to work with those over the course of the coming Parliament to make the case even further.
Well, I look forward to the conversation starting. I think it's an interesting idea, and I do love discussing it, and I do love hearing people discussing, because I think there's a lot to talk about. So, Michael, thank you for giving us your time. Michael Pugh there, Director and Co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. The website goes live tomorrow, Monday, basicincomeconversation.org. We'll be straight back after this.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker.